The story begins not in the glare of daylight, but in the suffocating silence of night. Imagine the palace corridors, walls of cold stone, flickering torches throwing long shadows, the air heavy with a sense of secrets untold. In these chambers, whispers carried more power than swords, and the faintest rumor could end lives. Behind silk curtains and gilded doors, love, betrayal, and ambition conspired together, setting the stage for a tragedy so shocking that history itself struggled to record it without trembling. Our focus is a queen, one of the most powerful women of her age, yet also one of the loneliest. Surrounded by courtiers who obeyed but never loved her, bound by duty to a king who treated her as an instrument of alliance, she yearned for something more than cold ritual. And in that yearning, she found danger. Because in the medieval world, a queen's body did not belong to her. It belonged to the dynasty, the throne, the future of the realm. Any step beyond the sanctioned path of loyalty and obedience was not just a private sin, but a political crime that could topple nations. Into this silence entered a man, a figure whose presence burned through the monotony of royal life. Whether he was a courtier, a knight, or perhaps someone sworn to the queen's protection, history leaves fragments rather than clarity. What it does tell us is this: against every law of custom and crown, the queen allowed herself to fall. What began as stolen glances in the corridors became whispered conversations, then secret meetings, until passion crossed the threshold into forbidden territory. But in palaces built on surveillance and intrigue, nothing remained hidden for long. Servants saw more than they were meant to. Ladies-in-waiting whispered behind embroidered fans. Guards exchanged knowing looks. In a court where political enemies waited for any misstep, the queen's secret was not simply a matter of love. It was a dagger hanging above her head, ready to fall. And yet, the queen pressed forward. For the first time, she tasted a freedom denied to her since her wedding day. This affair was not only about desire, it was about rebellion. Against her husband, against her station, against the chains of a life she had never chosen. But rebellion inside a palace always had a cost, and this cost would soon be paid in blood. The tragedy begins with the two princes, her sons. They were children of the crown, heirs to the dynasty, innocent symbols of future stability. To their mother, they were her pride, perhaps her only source of true affection. But in the cruel paradox of this tale, the same chambers where she once cradled them would become the place of their execution. For love, secrecy, and betrayal would entangle not just the guilty, but the innocent. Picture the queen's private chamber, velvet drapes, candlelight glinting on polished wood, a sanctuary meant to protect royal blood. This was the place of comfort, where children might hide from the storms of politics and war outside the palace walls. And yet, it would transform into a stage of horror, where trust dissolved into terror, and the royal bloodline was torn apart not by armies on the battlefield, but by shadows moving silently within their own home. Even centuries later, historians debate the exact sequence of events, and chroniclers, often bound to serve the victorious, paint different versions of the queen's sins. Some describe her as a cold and calculating woman who allowed her passions to cloud her duty, betraying her children and crown alike. Others depict her as a tragic figure, trapped, unloved, and punished for reaching for the simplest of human desires, companionship. What unites them all is the image of a scandal so monstrous that it ended with two young princes beheaded in the very chamber where they once found safety in their mother's arms. This opening moment is not just the beginning of a scandal. It is the descent into one of history's most chilling stories. A story where the boundaries between love and destruction collapse, where motherhood and betrayal collide, and where the echoes of a single forbidden decision would reverberate for generations. By the end of this journey, we will explore how this affair was born, how it spiraled out of control, how whispers sharpened into swords, and how the final night unfolded with blood staining the queen's most intimate sanctuary. We will trace not only the events, but the psychology, the loneliness that drove her, the paranoia that consumed the court, and the terror that silenced two royal heirs forever. And so, as we step deeper into the shadows of this story, remember, history is not always a tale of kings and battles. Sometimes it is a story of whispers in dark corridors, of love that defied law, and of children who paid the ultimate price for secrets they never asked to bear. This is the forbidden affair that ended not with a coronation or a war, but with the muffled cries of two princes in their mother's chamber, where the line between desire and destruction was finally, fatally crossed. Royal courts were never places of safety. They glittered with jewels and gold, yet beneath that shine lay a pit of venomous snakes, courtiers who smiled while plotting your downfall, allies who shifted into rivals overnight, and enemies who lingered in every shadow. In this world, trust was rare, and survival depended not only on power but on secrecy. The queen lived at the heart of this storm. To the outside world, she appeared untouchable, draped in silk, crowned in jewels, her every move watched and celebrated. Yet behind the layers of ceremony, she was trapped. Married not for love but for politics, her union had secured alliances, strengthened bloodlines, and pleased kings and advisors. It was a marriage designed for empire, not for intimacy. Loneliness became her constant companion. A palace filled with hundreds of voices still offered no one who truly listened. The king, distant and often cold, regarded her more as an emblem than a partner. Nights in her chambers were silent. Days were filled with rituals that drained her spirit. A queen in name, but a prisoner in practice. And it was in this silence that danger crept in. A man, perhaps a knight of noble birth, perhaps a courtier trusted by the king, crossed paths with her often enough that routine glances turned into lingering stares. At first, nothing more than a spark. But sparks, in the dry and suffocating air of the court, could set entire kingdoms ablaze. What began innocently soon grew bolder. Secret exchanges of words, coded meanings hidden within courtly compliments. In a world where love was forbidden, subtlety was survival. Every brush of the hand, every stolen moment, was drenched in risk. To her, he was not simply a lover, he was freedom. To him, she was not only a queen, but a forbidden fruit more intoxicating than any crown could offer. The affair ignited like wildfire behind closed doors, yet maintaining its secrecy was an impossible task in a palace designed for surveillance. Servants folded linens but unfolded secrets. Maids heard the whispers through thin walls. Guards noticed who lingered too long outside her chambers. And though some were loyal, others saw opportunity. Knowledge of such a scandal was a weapon that could be traded for favor, money, or safety. As rumors began to ripple, the queen's situation grew perilous. For in her world, adultery was more than betrayal, it was treason. A queen's fidelity was not a personal matter. It was the very cornerstone of dynastic legitimacy. If her children were suspected to be born not of the king's seed but of another man's, the entire royal bloodline could be questioned. Armies had gone to war over less. Still, the queen pressed forward. Perhaps she believed herself untouchable, shielded by her crown. Perhaps she underestimated the court's hunger for scandal. Or perhaps the loneliness of years outweighed the fear of death. Whatever her reasoning, each meeting pulled her further into a web that could not be undone. Whispers began to swirl in the corridors, reaching the ears of her enemies. For every court was divided into factions, those loyal to the queen, those loyal to the king, and those loyal to nothing but ambition. The affair became a secret everyone knew, but no one dared to speak aloud, waiting for the right moment to strike. The queen herself walked a razor's edge. By day, she appeared regal and composed, performing her duties with flawless precision. By night, she risked everything in pursuit of forbidden passion. The duality consumed her, queen by daylight, rebel by darkness. And in that duality lay the seeds of tragedy. The princes, still young, were oblivious, or perhaps not entirely. Children in palaces learned early that appearances rarely matched reality. They may have sensed their mother's distraction, her sudden brightness in the presence of certain courtiers, her shadowed worry when whispers spread through the halls. Whether they understood or not, their lives were already caught in the current of a storm far greater than themselves. The court itself became a stage of silent warfare. Allies of the king sharpened their suspicions, waiting for proof. Loyalists of the queen scrambled to protect her, bribing servants, silencing gossip, and weaving excuses to cover her absences. Every banquet, every council meeting, every procession became a battle of glances and half-spoken accusations. But history shows that secrets, once whispered, can never be buried. The affair was now an open secret, a scandal waiting to erupt. And in courts where power shifted like sand, rumors were deadlier than swords. All it would take was one betrayal, one enemy whispering the right words in the right ear, and the queen's world would collapse. The story of the affair was not simply about passion, it was about defiance. In choosing love, the queen had defied her king, her dynasty, her role, and the entire political order of her time. And such defiance, no matter how human or understandable, was destined to be punished with cruelty. Here lies the cruel irony. The queen sought warmth in a cold world, and in reaching for it, she unknowingly set into motion a chain of events that would lead to the deaths of the very children she cherished most. Love, in the heart of a queen, was never innocent, it was lethal. And as rumors hardened into accusations, as whispers sharpened into blades, the stage was set. What began with stolen glances would soon end in blood. For in royal courts, passion was not simply a private sin. It was treason, and treason always demanded a sacrifice. Whispers are like smoke. At first they drift through the air, faint, elusive, easy to dismiss. But given time, they gather, thicken, and suffocate. In the palace, where silence was rare and secrets rarer still, whispers about the queen's forbidden affair began to swirl so heavily that no corner of the court remained untouched. For months, maybe years, the queen had danced a dangerous waltz, smiling in public, burning in secret, walking each day across a floor of glass that could shatter beneath her at any moment. But no one in history keeps a secret forever, not in a place where gossip was currency and betrayal was often the surest path to power. The court had been waiting. Rival factions, long resentful of the queen's influence, began sharpening their suspicions into accusations. Servants who had once turned a blind eye now whispered in exchange for coin. Jealous courtiers, those who had lost favor, those denied the queen's attention, those loyal to the king, fanned the embers of scandal until they burned into near certainty. The affair was no longer rumor. It was evidence in the making. A misplaced letter, a sighting at the wrong hour, the sudden absence of a guard from his post. Each piece became a nail hammered into the coffin of the queen's secrecy. In a palace fueled by paranoia, truth was less important than perception, and perception had already turned against her. The king, though perhaps long suspicious, now faced the whispers directly. Imagine his position, ruler of a fragile kingdom, needing heirs whose bloodlines must remain unquestioned. To discover, or even to suspect, that his queen had taken a lover was not only a personal humiliation but a political earthquake. Every noble ally would question the legitimacy of his heirs. Every enemy would seize the chance to weaken his throne. His rage would not simply be that of a husband betrayed. It would be the fury of a king whose dynasty had been mocked before the eyes of the world. And the princes, innocent, yet fatally vulnerable, stood at the center of this storm. As whispers spread, their very existence became suspect. Were they truly the king's sons? Or were they, as enemies insinuated, the children of another man, conceived in shadows? No child chooses the circumstances of their birth, yet in the venomous politics of a court, such doubts could kill. And soon, they would. The queen's paranoia grew. Each time she entered the hall, she could feel eyes burning into her. A cough from across the room sounded like mockery. A bowed head from a servant seemed laced with knowledge. She was trapped in a hall of mirrors, unable to tell loyalty from betrayal, truth from rumor. What she did know, however, was this: the noose was tightening. Her lover, too, lived under constant fear. Once a man of confidence and charm, he now flinched at every sound outside his chamber door, wondering if it would be the last he heard before soldiers dragged him to a dungeon. Together, they were two souls bound by passion, but now also by terror. Every stolen meeting that had once been thrilling became a desperate risk, a final taste of freedom before the inevitable end. Meanwhile, the king's advisors circled like vultures. They whispered poison into his ears, urging swift action before the scandal grew beyond control. To do nothing, they warned, would be to let treason fester in the heart of the kingdom. To act would be brutal, yes, but decisive, an example carved in blood that no one would dare challenge. The queen's allies scrambled to protect her, but even they could not silence the rising tide. Some attempted bribes. Others spread counter-rumors, framing rivals, creating diversions. Yet, in the end, the momentum was unstoppable. Too many people had seen too much. Too many knives were eager to strike. The palace itself seemed to turn against her. Doors that once opened easily now closed in her face. Conversations halted as she entered rooms. The tapestries on the walls, embroidered with stories of kings and queens of old, seemed to mock her, reminding her of past rulers who had fallen from grace, devoured by the same merciless system of power. The moment of reckoning approached like a storm on the horizon. There would be no escape, no chance to undo the past. History is clear on this. Once a queen was accused of adultery, especially when it threatened the legitimacy of heirs, the outcome was always drenched in blood. Her enemies prepared the stage for exposure, gathering witnesses, evidence, and allies. But in this story, there would be no trial, no public humiliation. The punishment would come swiftly, quietly, and fatally. The whispers that had haunted the queen for so long were now sharpening into swords, blades drawn not just for her lover, but for her children. This was the cruelest paradox of all. The queen's attempt to claim her own humanity, to feel love beyond the chains of duty, had placed the very lives of her sons in jeopardy. The princes had no part in the affair, no understanding of the politics swirling around them, yet they were condemned simply by being the queen's blood. The stage was set for the night that history would never forget, a night when shadows would invade the queen's most private chambers, when muffled footsteps would lead to the sound of steel being unsheathed, when the innocence of two princes would be silenced forever. And as the palace drifted into uneasy sleep, a final truth became clear. In courts of power, love was never safe, secrets were never secret, and whispers, once sharp enough, always turned into swords. Night had fallen over the palace. The moon hung low, a pale eye in the sky, watching silently as shadows crept across the corridors. Torches burned dimly along the stone walls, their flames swaying as if in anticipation of the horror to come. The palace guards moved with unusual tension, their boots echoing in unison, their eyes sharp, as though every man knew what would soon unfold. Inside her chamber, the queen sat in uneasy silence. The chamber, once her sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Heavy drapes shut out the world. The glow of candles softened the vast room, but nothing could still her pounding heart. She had lived in fear of whispers, but whispers were nothing compared to the silence of this night, the silence that comes before a blade is drawn. Her sons, the princes, were with her, too young to understand the depths of treachery surrounding them, too innocent to grasp that their mother's secrets had placed them in mortal peril. To them, this was just another night in the safety of their mother's presence. Perhaps they were already asleep, their small forms curled beneath embroidered covers, or perhaps they were restless, sensing in some unspoken way the dread that filled the air. Children often feel storms before adults admit them. Then came the sound, muffled at first, boots against stone, metal brushing metal, the creak of doors opening where no door should open at this hour. The queen stiffened. She knew. Every instinct screamed that the moment had come. The storm she had feared, the whispers that had chased her through hallways, the suspicion that had spread like rot. Tonight, they would take form in steel. The chamber door groaned open. Shadows spilled inside before the men did. Soldiers, faces grim, eyes hard, entered with measured steps. They carried no banners, no proclamations, only the quiet authority of death. These were not men of mercy. They had not come to arrest, nor to question, nor to warn. They had come to silence. The queen rose, her voice breaking as she demanded to know what crime they dared commit in the sanctity of her chamber. But the soldiers did not answer. Orders weighed heavier than conscience. The silence of their march was more terrifying than any words. Behind them, the steel gleam of drawn swords caught the candlelight, reflecting like shards of a broken future. The princes stirred. One of them, perhaps the elder, sat up in confusion, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His young voice cut through the tension. "Mother?" The word, so small, so innocent, carried more weight than any accusation or defense ever could. For in that moment, the fate of royalty and innocence collided. The soldiers advanced. The queen's pleas turned to screams. She may have thrown herself before them, shielding her sons with her body, clawing at the assassins, her cries echoing through the chamber. History does not tell us the exact words she spoke, only that her anguish was unbearable. But even queens were powerless against swords. The first blade fell, a swift, merciless strike. The sound of steel slicing through the air, the dull thud as it met flesh. Gasps and cries filled the chamber. The elder prince's head was taken before he even understood why men in armor had invaded his mother's sanctuary. His blood spilled across the silk sheets, staining the bed that once symbolized safety and warmth. The younger prince, terrified, tried to flee, perhaps reaching for his mother's embrace, perhaps calling out for help that would never come. He was seized, his small frame powerless against armored hands. The queen's screams grew shriller, breaking into sobs, but the second blade did not hesitate. With a single motion, the boy's life was cut short, his head severed, his cries silenced forever. The chamber, once filled with the laughter of children, now echoed only with the queen's wails and the dripping of blood onto polished stone. Two princes, symbols of the kingdom's future, lay lifeless at her feet, their innocence extinguished by the ruthless politics of the court. Why were the children killed? To erase doubt, to erase scandal, to erase the possibility that illegitimate heirs might one day lay claim to the throne. The logic was cold, brutal, and absolute. Better to shed royal blood in secret than allow whispers to fracture a dynasty. And so, two boys became victims of an affair they never chose, pawns sacrificed to protect the image of a crown that had already been corrupted. For the queen, this was a punishment beyond comprehension. To suffer her own downfall would have been one thing, but to see her sons executed in the very room where she had nursed them, comforted them, and sworn to protect them was a torment designed not just to punish, but to annihilate her soul. The message was clear. She had betrayed the dynasty, and the dynasty would exact its price in blood closest to her heart. The soldiers, once their grim work was done, left as silently as they had come. The chamber door closed, and with it, the queen's world ended. She remained surrounded by the still forms of her children, her cries echoing into the void, unheard by those who had already judged her guilty. For hours, perhaps, she stayed there, rocking the lifeless bodies, whispering apologies, cursing fate, cursing herself. Some chronicles suggest she collapsed into madness that night, her mind unable to reconcile what had been taken from her. Others claim she sat in silence, her grief so profound it transformed into a hollow, unblinking stare. History cannot record the exact sound of her grief, but it tells us that it reverberated through the palace, chilling even those who had ordered the act. That night, the palace did not sleep. Servants whispered in horror. Courtiers tiptoed through corridors, fearful of being the next to fall. Even the king, who may or may not have directly given the order, could not escape the shadow of what had been done in his name. A dynasty had been saved, but at the cost of innocence, at the cost of a mother's sanity, at the cost of honor itself. The image of that chamber would linger long after the candles burned out. The bed, once a symbol of life and legacy, now marked forever as a place of slaughter. The silence of the night, broken by the queen's cries, became the silence of history, uncomfortable, haunting, unforgettable. This was no battlefield victory, no noble sacrifice. It was an intimate massacre. Two princes, cut down not in war, but in their mother's sanctuary. Their deaths were not the result of fate, but of whispers turned to swords, of secrets transformed into blood. And so the forbidden affair reached its climax, not with passion, but with horror, not with love's triumph, but with its brutal annihilation. What began with longing glances ended with severed heads. A queen's heart was broken, a dynasty shaken, and history scarred by one of the most chilling acts ever committed within the walls of a royal palace. The night of blood had ended, but its echoes lingered like smoke after a fire. Dawn broke over the palace, casting pale light through narrow windows, but there was no warmth in that sunrise. Instead, the rays revealed what shadows had hidden, the aftermath of an act so unspeakable that even those who had carried it out struggled to look one another in the eye. In the queen's chamber, silence hung heavy. The bodies of the princes had been removed under cover of darkness, wrapped in cloth, their burial hushed, unmarked by ceremony. A royal death should have been honored with trumpets, prayers, and mourning processions. Instead, these boys were erased like stains, hidden away as though their very existence had been an inconvenience. The dynasty could not afford questions. It could not afford grief. It could only afford silence. But silence did not fool the court. Servants whispered, as servants always did. They spoke of soldiers slipping through corridors at midnight, of muffled cries behind closed doors, of blood that stained sheets and stone. Some claimed to have seen the queen clawing at the assassins. Others swore they heard her wails echoing through the palace. Details blurred in the retelling, but one truth was certain. Something monstrous had happened in the queen's chamber, and it could not be contained forever. The queen herself was a ghost of the woman she had once been. To those who saw her in the days after, she seemed hollow, her face drained of life, her eyes empty wells that held no light. Some chronicles say she refused to eat, refused to leave her chamber, clutching the memory of her sons as if they were still there. Others claim she screamed through the nights, her voice breaking until she could no longer make sound, her grief dissolving into silence. Whether shattered or stoic, one thing was undeniable. The punishment she suffered was far greater than any dungeon or blade could deliver. Politically, the court scrambled to reassert order. Advisors spun the narrative carefully. They could not admit openly that princes had been executed. Such an admission would shatter the dynasty's legitimacy. Instead, rumors were diverted, reshaped. The princes were said to have died of illness, or to have been taken away secretly for their protection. Lies spread faster than truth, each version designed to smother questions rather than answer them. But the people, those beyond the palace walls, were not so easily fooled. Rumors leaked into taverns, markets, and streets. Mothers whispered to one another that the queen's children had been stolen. Fathers cursed the throne under their breath, certain that the monarchy they supported with their taxes was drenched in blood. For every attempt to conceal the truth, 10 more whispers took its place, weaving a shroud of unease over the entire kingdom. The king, though officially untouched by scandal, could not escape the shadow of what had been done. Whether he had ordered the killings directly, or whether his advisors acted in his name, mattered little. His silence was as damning as any confession. To some, he appeared strong, decisive enough to extinguish treason before it consumed the crown. To others, he appeared monstrous, a father complicit in the murder of his own sons. Trust in the monarchy, already fragile, cracked under the weight of suspicion. The queen's lover, too, faced his fate. Accounts differ. Some say he was executed swiftly, his head displayed as proof of justice served. Others whisper he was imprisoned, left to rot in chains, his memory scrubbed from official records. A few suggest he escaped, vanishing into exile, though this version reads more like legend than truth. Whatever his end, he became the invisible ghost behind the scandal, the man whose passion with a queen had lit the fuse of destruction. What makes the aftermath most chilling is not just the deaths themselves, but the ripple effect they caused. Nobles who once allied with the queen's faction now distanced themselves, fearful of being tainted by her disgrace. Foreign courts, hearing rumors of princes slaughtered in their mother's chamber, questioned the stability of the dynasty. Rivals sharpened their daggers, sensing weakness. What had begun as an attempt to protect the crown had instead cracked its very foundation. And yet, the official story marched forward as if nothing had happened. Ceremonies continued, councils met, the king presided with his crown gleaming in the sunlight. But behind the smiles and pageantry lay a cord in fear. Everyone knew how swiftly power could turn to ruin. If princes could be slaughtered, who was safe? If whispers could lead to swords, who could speak freely? For the queen, the aftermath was not simply political, it was psychological annihilation. She lived with the knowledge that her own choices, her own desires, had opened the door for her children's deaths. Whether she blamed herself or cursed her enemies, history does not say. But the image of her son's final moments would have haunted her until her last breath. A punishment beyond the imagination of even her worst foes. The kingdom as a whole reeled. Some saw the tragedy as divine punishment, a reminder that rulers who defied sacred vows would be humbled by fate. Others saw it as proof of human cruelty, that love, politics, and power could twist into something darker than hell itself. The people mourned silently, for to mourn openly was to invite accusations of disloyalty. Yet in the quiet of their homes, mothers held their children tighter, fearful of a world where innocence could be slaughtered so coldly. Thus, the aftermath was not a clean ending, but a wound that never healed. The palace, though restored in appearance, carried a stain invisible to the eye, but heavy on the soul. Those who walked its halls years later still spoke of a lingering chill in the queen's chamber, as though the walls themselves remembered the night of blood. The dynasty continued, yes. The crown endured, but it endured at a cost. The trust of its people, the love of its queen, the innocence of two princes who never asked to be born into a world of secrets and treachery. History does not forget nights like this. They linger in whispers, in half-told stories, in the uneasy glances of courtiers. And in this case, the aftermath became more than a scandal. It became a curse, a shadow that followed the dynasty for generations, a reminder that love, when entangled with power, could unravel empires. History has a cruel way of remembering. Kings are praised for victories, queens are immortalized for beauty, but scandals become shadows that refuse to fade. The forbidden affair that led to two princes' deaths was not just a tragedy confined to a single night. It became a stain that clung to the dynasty, shaping how future generations viewed both the crown and the woman at its center. In the official records of the court, the event was softened, even obscured. Chroniclers loyal to the monarchy altered details, erased names, and wrapped the story in ambiguity. To admit outright that princes had been executed in their own mother's chamber would have been political suicide. And so the official history offered vague references, whispers of treason, sudden illnesses, heirs sent away for their safety. But rumors are more enduring than ink. Where the official story tried to silence, gossip preserved the truth. Within a generation, the tale spread across Europe's courts, carried by ambassadors, travelers, and enemies of the crown. Foreign monarchs told the story with relish, a queen's betrayal, a king's cold vengeance, and children who paid with their lives. To them, it was more than scandal. It was a cautionary tale about what happens when personal desire collides with dynastic duty. Among the people, the legacy took on a darker, almost supernatural form. Some swore that the queen's chamber was cursed, that no matter how many times it was renovated or blessed, a chill lingered in the air. Servants spoke of hearing faint cries at night, the voices of the murdered princes echoing from beyond the grave. Others claimed to see fleeting shadows of children darting past doorways, forever trapped in the palace where their lives had been stolen. Whether these were ghosts or guilty imaginations, no one could say. But such stories only deepened the tragedy's grip on the cultural memory. For the queen herself, her legacy became a paradox. In some retellings, she was the villain, the woman whose reckless passion unleashed a chain of betrayal and bloodshed. In others, she was the victim, a mother broken by a ruthless court that used her affair as a weapon to destroy her children. History rarely grants women the luxury of nuance, and so she was painted in extremes, seductress or martyr, sinner or saint. The truth likely lay somewhere between, but truth mattered less than narrative, and the narrative was damning. The princes, meanwhile, became symbols. They were no longer just boys who had laughed, played, and learned in the halls of the palace. They became emblems of innocence crushed by politics, their story retold as a warning to future heirs. Never trust the walls of your own home, for even there, betrayal can find you. The king's legacy, too, was poisoned. Whatever triumphs he may have achieved, victories in war, reforms in governance, were forever overshadowed by whispers that he had allowed, or even ordered, the execution of his own sons. To his enemies, he was a tyrant who valued power above blood. To his supporters, he was a tragic figure forced into impossible choices. Yet across centuries, his image remained marked by suspicion. The crown endured, but it glistened less brightly. As time passed, poets, dramatists, and historians seized upon the tale. Some retold it as tragedy, with the queen as a doomed lover whose passion destroyed her family. Others twisted it into morality plays, using her downfall to warn against adultery, ambition, and female agency. Every retelling bent the story to fit its audience, yet all returned to the same haunting image. Two princes, their lives stolen in the very room where they should have been safest. By the Victorian era, when society was fascinated with Gothic horrors and royal scandals, the story resurfaced with new force. Writers embellished it, painting the queen as a femme fatale and the king as a tyrant. Pamphlets whispered of curses, portraits were studied for hidden guilt, and the tale slipped into the broader tapestry of Europe's darkest royal secrets. Even today, historians debate the details: what truly happened, who gave the order, whether the affair was as forbidden and scandalous as later accounts claimed. But the uncertainty only fuels the fascination. The deeper legacy of the affair is not confined to politics or ghost stories. It lies in the way it reveals the fragility of power itself. Monarchies present themselves as eternal, ordained by God, yet behind the gilded doors, they are as vulnerable to jealousy, passion, and betrayal as any common household. A single affair, a single night, a single decision can unravel centuries of tradition. The death of those princes was more than a family tragedy. It was proof that the mighty could fall prey to their own humanity. And so, the legacy of blood and betrayal endures not because it was unique, but because it was universal. It was the story of love turned lethal, of power consuming innocence, of a mother's heart torn between passion and duty. Such themes transcend centuries, echoing every time a dynasty crumbles, every time a secret affair threatens to destabilize a throne, every time history reminds us that behind crowns and jewels are people with fragile, flawed hearts. Even now, when historians trace the lineages of Europe's royal families, the affair remains a dark footnote, proof that every glittering dynasty carries with it a shadow. The two princes, unnamed in many accounts, are remembered not for who they were, but for how they died. And perhaps that is the cruelest legacy of all. The Queen's chamber still stands, silent stone walls that have seen centuries pass. Tourists walk through without knowing the blood that once stained the floors, the cries that once pierced the night. Yet for those who know the story, it is impossible to stand there without feeling the weight of ghosts, without imagining the forbidden love, the betrayal, and the terrible price paid in the name of power. History closes its pages, but the echoes remain. The forbidden affair may have ended with two princes beheaded in their mother's bedroom chamber, but its legacy endures, a timeless reminder that power and passion, when entwined, can birth tragedies that outlive all who played their part. Centuries have passed since that night of betrayal, yet the story refuses to die. The palace walls have been restored, the dynasty has shifted, and new rulers have worn the crown. But whenever people speak of royal secrets, forbidden passions, or the brutality of power, the tale of the queen, her lover, and her murdered sons rises again, like a ghost that cannot be laid to rest. Why does this particular tragedy hold such a grip on our imagination? Perhaps because it reveals something we would rather not admit, that history is not built only by battles and treaties, but by fragile human emotions: love, lust, jealousy, fear. Behind every gilded throne is a beating human heart, and when that heart falters, kingdoms tremble. The affair shows us the collision between private desire and public duty. For the queen, love was not just forbidden, it was fatal. In a world where her worth was measured by loyalty to her husband and the crown, stepping outside those bounds meant her downfall. Yet can anyone truly blame her for wanting affection, passion, or escape? Her humanity clashed with her role, and the cost was unbearable. It also forces us to confront the brutality of power. A crown is supposed to symbolize protection, justice, and order. Yet here, it became a weapon. Instead of shielding the innocent, the throne demanded their sacrifice. The two princes remind us that in systems built on power, innocence often suffers first. But the story also lingers because it mirrors patterns we still see today. Royal families may no longer wield absolute power, but scandals born of love, betrayal, and hidden affairs still capture headlines. Political leaders, celebrities, even ordinary families, again and again, lives unravel when passion collides with expectation. We may flatter ourselves by believing we are different from the past, yet human nature has not changed. Desire still tempts, ambition still corrupts, and secrets still destroy. There is also the psychological dimension. The queen's suffering, whether she was remembered as sinner or victim, highlights how societies judge women harshly in ways men often escape. Her lover is a footnote. Her sons are martyrs. But she is forever branded, the woman whose choices unleashed ruin. Even in death, her image is debated more than her humanity is remembered. This imbalance speaks not only to the misogyny of her time, but to questions that still haunt us today. And then there are the whispers, the ghosts said to linger in her chamber. Whether or not you believe in curses or restless spirits, such legends reveal a deeper truth. When tragedy is so shocking, it leaves an imprint not just on stone walls, but on the collective memory of a people. Every creak of the floor, every draft of cold air becomes a reminder of blood that should never have been spilled. In the end, the story of the Forbidden Affair is not simply about one queen, two princes, or a kingdom in chaos. It is about the fragility of trust, the danger of secrets, and the terrible cost of desire when bound by power. It is a reminder that history is written in both glory and grief, in both triumph and betrayal. And perhaps that is why, even today, we are drawn to it. Because it does not just tell us about the past, it holds up a mirror in which we see the same flaws, the same longings, the same capacity for destruction that still lives in us all. So the next time you hear of a scandal, whether whispered in a palace or splashed across the headlines, remember the queen, her lover, and the princes who never lived to become kings. Remember that behind every throne, behind every glittering image of power, there are secrets. Some hidden, some whispered, and some, like this one, paid for in blood. Her story truly begins in the place where most stories would prefer to end, in the shadow of the gallows. The first sounds she ever heard as an infant were not the lullabies of a mother's voice or the gentle whispers of affection, but the roar of a crowd demanding blood. Her father was the city's executioner, a man whose hands were always stained with death, whose name was never spoken without a shiver. To the crown and its laws, he was essential, a necessary tool of justice. But to the people, he was cursed. The man who severed heads, who hanged thieves, who burned witches. He was no better than the condemned themselves. And because she was his child, she was marked with the same invisible stain. From the earliest days of her childhood, she lived apart from others. The neighbors never let their children play with her. Merchants hesitated to sell bread to her father's family, muttering that the stink of blood followed them into the marketplace. Even the church, the one place meant for all souls, forced them to sit in the last row, their heads bowed not from reverence but from shame. She grew up watching her father endure this silent exile with grim acceptance, as if he understood that his service to the city condemned not only him, but his bloodline forever. She remembered standing in the small wooden room they called home, staring at the heavy boots her father wore when he walked to the scaffold. She had heard his axe sharpened late into the night, the grinding sound like a lullaby of steel, echoing through the walls as she drifted to sleep. She never saw fear in his eyes, only the weight of inevitability. He had long since surrendered to the knowledge that he was both needed and despised, tolerated only because the rulers required his hand to carry out their sentences. The people spat when he passed, yet they cheered when his blade fell. And while he carried his shame in silence, she carried it differently. Children can endure hunger, even cold, but what she could not endure was humiliation. She remembered being dragged from school by the hair, mocked as the butcher's spawn. She remembered the way noble boys would sneer at her, taunting that one day she would grow up to marry a hangman or a gravedigger, because no one else would touch her cursed blood. She carried those words with her like scars carved into her very soul. Her mother's love was the only light in her early life, though even that light was dim and fleeting. Her mother, too, was marked by association, pitted by some, despised by others. In whispered moments, she tried to reassure her daughter that she was not defined by her father's profession, that she could choose her own path. But illness took her too soon, leaving the girl alone with a father who did not know how to nurture, only how to endure. In the silence that followed her mother's death, bitterness took root in the child's heart. And yet, growing up in the shadow of the scaffold gave her an education unlike any other. While noble children were schooled in poetry, manners, and the art of command, she learned the anatomy of the human body from watching her father work. She knew where veins pulsed beneath the skin, where an axe must strike to end a life cleanly, how long it took for a body to hang before breath gave way to stillness. Death became as familiar to her as bread or water. She did not recoil from it, because it was the only inheritance she had ever been given. Still, she was not without imagination. She would sit by the window and watch the nobility ride past in their carriages, dressed in silks and jewels, their laughter echoing through the streets as if the world itself belonged to them. She longed for that life, not because she wished for riches, but because she wished for freedom. Freedom from the sneers, from the pointed fingers, from the whispered curses that followed her every step. She dreamed of removing her mask of shame and replacing it with a mask of power. As she grew older, her resentment sharpened. She began to notice that the very nobles who laughed at her father's profession were the same ones who delivered men and women to him. Their judgments filled his hands with work, yet they looked down upon him for carrying out what they themselves decreed. Hypocrisy dripped from every corner of their smiles, and the young girl began to see the nobles not as protectors of order, but as predators cloaked in finery. By the time she reached womanhood, her heart had hardened into something dangerous. The humiliation of her youth, the absence of her mother, the cold indifference of society, all converged into a single truth. She was not meant to be a daughter of light. She was a child of shadows, molded by the rhythm of the axe and the silence of the crowd that condemned her before she could even speak. And yet, within those shadows, something else stirred, a resolve that went beyond bitterness. She did not want to simply endure as her father had endured. She wanted to strike back. She wanted to make the nobles, the same ones who mocked her and used her father as their instrument, taste the very blade they had forced upon her family. Thus, the foundation of her fate was laid. She was a child born into blood, raised in exile, and shaped by a world that treated her existence as a curse. Society had placed a mask upon her face long before she would ever don one at the carnival. But where others saw only disgrace, she began to see possibility. In her silence, she was already sharpening not just knives, but her will. The executioner's daughter was not destined to remain a victim of scorn. Step by step, humiliation would forge her into something far more dangerous than anyone suspected. She would carry the shadows of her childhood into adulthood, and with them, she would carve her own name into history, not as a forgotten outcast, but as a figure whose vengeance would drench the carnival in crimson. The Midnight Carnival was not just a festival. It was a mirror, one polished in gold and laughter, yet cracked by rot that few dared to acknowledge. On the surface, it was the crown's great offering to the people, one night of freedom when the laws of class seemed to blur, when masks gave commoners a chance to